Right, hello everybody. My name's Jess and I work for the Royal Air Force Museum. You might have seen the last talk that we did where I explained that Life Stories is usually a series of talks we have on site at RAF Museum Cosford. But as we all know, social distancing has restricted things like that, so we can't all sit in a lecture theatre together. So we've decided, with the help of RAFA, to take these online instead. So thank you for joining us today. We've got Candy here with us, who has become a regular speaker at the museum. I met Candy quite a while ago now, a few years ago, and she's always given such a fantastic talk about her mother. So I won't give any spoilers. I'll just hand you straight over to Candy and remind you that you can feel free to ask some questions and we'll get them sorted at the end. So thank you very much. And Candy, take it away when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you to RAF Museums for sorting these wonderful talks out. I've been listening to a few of them and they're always an inspiration and a revelation. So I have a lot to compete with. So I hope today I can give you a little of an insight into my mother, Jackie Moggridge's life. It is very much from a woman's point of view through the war, and her love of flying that she enjoyed and was enthusiastic, and I hope inspires more people to fly. So what has she done to actually warrant you all listening to me today? Well, my sister and I were brought up in Taunton, Somerset, and we very much didn't know the extent to my mother's flying, because by the time we knew her, or I knew her, you know, the war seemed a very long time ago. My sister, however, had a lot of her growing up spent plonked on a seat next to my mother in an aeroplane, and here she is, Veronica Jill, with her husband. They now live in Spain. So what has my mother done to warrant you all listening? I started to type this little list of firsts that she'd achieved, and as I was adding it, I had to make the font smaller and smaller to fit on this one screen. And so I suddenly thought, goodness, I'd be thrilled with any one of these actual firsts, but she actually did all of them. So no need to read them because I'm going to tell you how she achieved it. It all started, she was born in South Africa and she went to a little convent school, and there she is in that second row. She felt very much an ugly little thing. She said, I was always so skinny and silly, and she wasn't very clever, and but she absolutely loved school, and she was very enthusiastic, but not about maths. She couldn't do math, hated maths, she's a very arty person. She loved English, but she also felt that she was sort of different from everybody else, and she wasn't pretty like the other girls. And one day she saw an aeroplane flying overhead and she thought, that's what I'll do. I'll be up there in the sky and then no one will be able to see me. She also had two very boisterous brothers, and here she is with her mother, and her mother's Veronica Saru, and then there's her two elder brothers, younger brothers, sorry, and they were actually teasing her and calling her a sissy, and as you can see there, they're all over 6 foot. So she actually thought, right, I'm going to show them, and she thought the aeroplane was a brilliant idea, so she told them all she was going to be a pilot. So she actually wrote off, just to make sure she really did tell them she was a pilot, she actually wrote off to the Aviation Institute in America, and here's the letter. She did the course, nothing to do with flying, of course. She didn't actually get in a plane, but she did do some sort of similar engineering tasks and things to do with engines, and she passed it, and she said, there you go, this is sort of age 15, and she said, look, I've done this, boys, I'm going to be a pilot, an aviator. But if you look at this, she actually weren't used to having obviously a woman, and the letter has, he has evidenced proof of an accurate understanding of aeroplane and engine construction, and I'm confident that he will make a capable and diligent worker when given the opportunity. And they've sort of crossed it out and put an S and turned it into she. So she showed this to her brothers, and of course they weren't impressed. They said, oh, you haven't even got in an aeroplane, don't tell me rubbish like that. So her mother said, okay, for your 15th birthday, I'll take you for a flight. Now, she'd never been in a plane in her life, and this is the plane they went up in, which is de Havilland Rapide. And she got in there really nervously, and she went up for a flight, and she was violently sick because she gets air sick, she gets car sick. And she came down and feeling it was a bit of a disaster. So her mother sort of let her go up again. And the next week when she went up, she just fell in love with it. And she thought, this is where I should be. This is what I love. So she immediately applied to start her private pilot's license, to have flying lessons. And her instructor took her up, and when on the first lesson, he came back down and said to her mother, well, you know, I'm sorry, but she'll never make a pilot. And my mother heard this and she thought, that's it. From then on, she was determined to prove him wrong. And she said she felt so strongly about this that she was going to become a pilot, come what may. She got her flying suit. There she is, so happy in her flying suit. And she traipsed on her bicycle to Johannesburg every day to be around the aerodrome. And flying lessons were expensive, so she did, you know, as many as that basically they could afford. And this was her little training plane that she started to fly. And as you can see, open cockpit, 2 wings, very much, you know, out in the open. And she took her private pilot's license, and when she took the day she took her test, she set off, she flew all around the aerodrome, and she and did her solo flight, and then whisked herself off back to Johannesburg, landed, said hello to people there, and flew back again. And her instructor was so furious with her. He said, I didn't mean you to go anywhere, I meant you to just fly around and land. But she was so excited, and she'd found her absolute joy in flying. And it's while she was in the South African airport that one of her heroines arrived. And this was the first woman commercial pilot to get her wings. She's Doreen Hooper, and this is what gave my mother the thought of, well, I've got my private pilot's license, I want to become a commercial pilot. So she talked to her mother, and her mother said, well, okay, Jackie's father had died before she was born, and he'd left her a bit of money, and her mother said, if you want to learn to fly, we could use that money for you to go to aeronautical college. Now, there weren't any aeronautical colleges in South Africa, so she couldn't go there. And they sent off letters applying to England. And while she was waiting for that, my mother decided she wanted to be the first girl to do a parachute jump in South Africa. So she didn't tell her mother. She convinced her mother that she needed a parachute because she needed it for safety when she was flying. So her mother dutifully bought her a parachute. And then Jackie set off trying to arrange her first parachute jump. Of course, there were no women's outfits for parachuting. There were no women's boots. She was in men's overalls, men's boots. She wasn't weighted properly. And there you can see her having her parachute put on before she goes up. She was in this open top bi-wing plane. Of course, the only way to get on out of that in the air was to clamber out and hold the strut and let go. Well, she said when she got up there, the weather wasn't very nice, unusual for South Africa. It was damp. It was slippery on the strut. She looked down and she saw the people who were waiting for her down at the bottom, and she thought, I can't do it. I can't let go. And then she thought, but they're all watching me, and if I go back into the plane, I'm going to look such a fool. So she jumped, and it was wet and damp, and the parachute made a Roman candle, so it didn't open properly. She wasn't weighted properly. It didn't open up fully, and she came down too fast, and she broke her ankle. and landed in a field of polo ponies. So there they are, picking her up. She's still smiling, and they take her off to hospital, where, of course, at her age, 15, she's thinking, she promptly falls in love with the doctor, who looks gorgeous, and decides she's going to plan another jump. And in fact, reading her diaries, she'd planned to do a second jump, but incognito, wear a wig, strap a radio to her back, and tell Radio South Africa what it's like to come down in a parachute. And her mum wouldn't recognise her, obviously, if she just put a wig on. Thank goodness it didn't happen, because she found out that she'd got in to Whitney Aeronautical College. Now, there were none of the other aeronautical colleges wanted a woman, but Whitney in Oxford decided they would take her. So it meant, of course, that she had to leave South Africa. She had to leave her beloved motorbike, which she'd moved on to from the bicycle. She loved her motorbike. And in fact, taking after her Uncle Joe, who was actually a motorbike riding racing ace. And she called her bike Jill. Of course, later on, when she had her firstborn child, my sister, she called her Veronica after her own mother, and Jill after the motorbike. So she left her motorbike behind and had to take a boat across to a 6-week journey under the care of some nuns to Oxford Aeronautical College. She was the only girl at Oxford Aeronautical College, and she, learning to fly, but there was one other girl there who was learning to be an engineer. And as my mother said, they were the really clever ones. This is where she had to work very hard. Her old aeronautical course helped her with some of the engines and things like that she needed to know, but the actual maths, she wasn't a natural. She said it was so hard to do the maths. She said she had to just sit there by rote and do it again and again and again until she got it. And she'd say to any schoolgirls watching, I do many talks to schools, and I'd said, her words were, if I can do it, anyone can. And she wanted so much to be a pilot, and she just had to do the maths to become a pilot, and she got there. And she said she also felt they had to get 100% as women, because otherwise they weren't really accepted or respected, and thought that they couldn't get these exams. And the pressure really was on, but she so admired the girl engineer, because she'd always said, well, they're the really clever ones. And actually she wrote a poem to engineers, and it says, enchanted by the glamour of a pilot's wings, the public seldom realise it will take them by surprise to find that there are many things towards the pilot's rise. It is the man who builds or mends the plane, who studied hard, spent years to train. And if that man had not been there, that gallant, striving engineer, perfection's my motto, he'd insist, the pilot's life would not exist. So she very much valued them, and to her, they were the people that got her in the air and kept her safe. Of course, she'd spent a whole year there, hadn't finished her course by then, and then war broke out, and she thought, oh my goodness, I've got to, I'm going to write off. She wrote immediately to her mother, who said, come home, darling, you've got to come straight home. She said, no, I've written to the RAF, I've offered my services, and I'm going to fly for the war effort. And she's waiting for a reply, and it says in her diaries, I haven't heard back. And of course, she got the letter where it said, I'm desperate. The RAF said they don't take women pilots. So she joined the WAF. Now, they put her in as a cook. She couldn't cook. She'd spent all her life in South Africa. She'd never cooked in her life. And, she went off, she was cooking for some very important person. And she'd gone off to get 1.5 potatoes she asked for at the vegetable shop, and he's going, what do you mean 1.5 potatoes? She says, well, that's what the recipe says, 1.5 potatoes. Anyway, that job didn't last very long, and she was transferred, and she was told to go to this island off Felixstowe, and then trained in a little room for 2 weeks and told it was very important, not allowed to tell anybody anything, and then transferred to Chain Home radio station in Rye. After the 2 weeks, they were told that they had been doing a very important job. And of course, it was radar. They were stuck in a room, very hot, lots of little cubicles, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Sometimes they had to just fall asleep under the desk. They were so tired, but they knew they were doing an important job. And of course, she watched the Battle of Britain as a series of dots on a screen. And she said at one early in the hours of the morning, she saw all these dots, or echoes as they called them, appearing on the screen. And she rang, as she was meant to report them. And they'd said, "Oh no, we've got no dots on our screens. You must be sleepy. It's very early in the morning." Anyway, of course, that was the start of the Battle of Britain and all the planes that were flying over. But it's also very moving, she said, when she was doing that job. And she writes it beautifully in her book. She says, "Anxiously, we appraised the results of our work until the two echoes joined in combat in a single oscillating blur that told of tally-ho, twisting evasions, screaming engines, the shrill rat-a-tat of machine guns, or the throw-cheer bark of cannon. We watched the eloquent echo as fathers, brothers, and lovers fought on the razor edge of life or death, and were silent if the echo, after battle, moved steadily eastwards towards enemy territory, leaving behind a dying echo that remained stationary for a few tragic seconds before fading as the life it represented faded into oblivion." And it's just so moving, but they felt that they were doing an incredibly important job. Meanwhile, an association called the ATA was being set up. And it had started with men that were too old to perhaps fly in this war, or had been injured and invalided out. And they needed their pilot skills because they hadn't got anyone to take the planes from the factories to the aerodromes, to the fighter pilots. There simply weren't enough pilots. So they took these men on board, started the Air Transport Auxiliary, or Ancient and Tired Airmen, as they like to dub it, and realised then that by 1940 that they had run out of men, and they were asking even for women pilots who'd had enough hours to train. At the very beginning, my mother hadn't had enough flying hours to join, but they'd relaxed the number of hours, and on the 19th of June in 1940, she received this letter. "Thank you for your form. Will you please let me know by return of post whether or not it's possible for you to report here at Hatfield Aerodrome for a flight test?" This meant that she could then apply to belong to the ATA, to fly, or to fly. She was absolutely thrilled. Pauline Gower, who was the head of the women of the ATA, had asked for her from radar, and radar had said, "Oh, she's doing far too important job, we can't release her." So my mother then had to spend agonizing a month and a half waiting for the battle for her to be released. And eventually, of course, Pauline Gower won, and Mummy started at the ATA. She got her ATA uniform. Look how thrilled she is there. She had her helmet. I've even got one actually in the cupboard up here behind me. And Pauline Gower, who was actually Mummy's absolute mentor. She took her under her wing. She even told her the facts of life, because my mum was so young. And there she is, this wonderful woman who actually also had managed to negotiate equal pay in the ATA for the men and the women, something that hadn't happened yet in civilian life. So a marvellous woman who took her girls on board. Mummy was number 15. She was the number 15 ATA girl, and she was at number 15 Ferrypool. And there she is. There they are, all the lovely girls. You can see my mother there in the middle. I don't know if my pointer's working very well. And then there they were at a reunion 50 years later at the Air Force Yacht Club. And you can see here, I've got my mother, Jackie Mogridge, in the bottom there. We've got Mary Ellis. We've got Molly Rose. We've got Diana Bonata, and all the amazing women that flew with her. Of course, they didn't meet some prejudice about the men. They were quite shocked, I think, when a plane arrived. In fact, one day my mother was flying in, looked down and saw, it's a lovely sunny day, saw the men all lounging around outside the hangar, and as she landed and got out, you know, brushed her hands through her hair, they suddenly all rushed inside, and she thought, well, oh gosh, what have I got, two heads or something? Anyway, when she got inside, she realized they'd all been outside, the men had all been outside sunbathing in the nude, and when they saw it was a woman arriving, they rushed in to put some clothes on. She'd also gone to pick up a plane. I mean, sometimes they flew up to 5 different planes a day when they were delivering these planes to different aerodromes, and she arrived to find that the commandant wouldn't release the plane to her, and she said, but I have to have it. Look, it's here written on the paper. You have to let me have the plane. And he said, I'm not giving my valuable plane to a little schoolgirl to fly. He had to ring head office until, of course, they were more used to having the girls flying. And of course, they did fly every single type of plane. She was stationed in Hamble, and she was obviously billeted with a lovely family. And I went to have a look to see where she actually lived. And
Morning, everyone. We appear to have lost Candy. Should be starting shortly, so just bear with us while we try and fix it. Jess, can you let me know that you can hear me?
let's go. So sorry. Right, I think that's my internet connection. Sorry, everybody. Hopefully we're all right now. Yeah, so I went to see this lovely little house, only to find the sign up next to it, which said coming soon. They're going to smash it down and build 3 new houses on that space. So I was lucky to see it, I think. So the girls, there were no, of course, facilities for these girls. So they landed in these aerodromes, you know, having flown for, you know, an hour and a half, an hour, maybe 2 or 3 flights in a row, only to find that obviously there were no ladies' loos. If they wanted to go, they had to use the men's, which wasn't always preferable. It was actually probably better to go behind the hangar, and which they often did, and one would look after the other. So one day my mum was just checking, you know, just looking out for a friend who was just squatting behind the hangar, and she suddenly saw the Vice Air Marshal coming, and she went, quick, the Vice Air Marshal's coming. And the poor girl said, my dear girl, she said, if the king himself was coming, I couldn't stop. So they had a lot to do with. Also, of course, they weren't allowed to eat in the officers' mess because that was men only. So they'd sit in the corridor, be brought their meal on a tray. But they didn't care because actually they felt so privileged to be flying these planes, and so privileged to be able to allow to fly. It was exciting and often dangerous work. They flew these planes from the factory that, you know, were new, so sometimes parts of them didn't work. In fact, I found a book on different aircraft that my mother had, and I'm flicking through it, and she's marked on each page, she's written on each one something about every plane she flew. And she's got one here, a Douglas A-20 Havoc, and it says, a nice aircraft, except for bits that fell off occasionally. And you could understand that, can't you? Because they didn't always work. And of course, the other thing is they didn't only fly the new ones, they also got to fly the ones that were being sent to be scrapped. So there were parts that didn't work. There were, you know, sometimes undercarriage wouldn't come down, and they landed, well, she landed on the grass without any undercarriage. But then most important was that you protected the plane. I mean, they were very expensive, and not only because, you know, the planes were valuable, but because the girls felt so proud to be able to be allowed to fly them, that if they felt that they had damaged a plane or crashed a plane, they would never be allowed to fly them again, because the men would go, oh, women pilots, like women drivers, you know, they can't do it. They had to fly these planes without any, they weren't allowed to use any of the ammunition or the guns or anything like that. They weren't allowed to touch the radio, so they had no contact with the ground. They flew simply with a map and a compass. The men and the women in the ATA weren't allowed to use any contact with the ground. And so they had to fly, and, you know, with the events that happened around them. So sometimes you'd be flying in and a barrage balloon would go up, and you were meant to know in advance if the barrage balloons were coming up. But sometimes, you know, the air raid would happen, and you'd be landing. My mother was landing and the barrage balloons went up. She had to veer across between them, ended up on the runway in the wrong position, and was heading for the gunner at the end of the runway, and all she could think was, I've got to not hit the gunner, and she swerved around and hit the hedge. Luckily, you know, it was a hedge, and the plane and herself were both all right. There was, you know, cloud would come down. They weren't meant to fly if it was cloudy, but of course, English weather, they'd set off, cloud would come down, and she would find herself, they were told not to go above the cloud, fly below the cloud, so that they could see. But you didn't know, if you couldn't see, if it was fog, you know, what you might hit. Of course, this is what happened to Amy Johnson, but more of her in a bit. So they used to call it Bradshawing. They used to follow the railways and the rivers, and to find their way to the next town. And they you know, well, flew by their wits. And of course, it wasn't just one plane they were flying. The fighter pilots had their own plane. They tended to fly their plane. They had to fly every type of plane. Her first ferry flight was on, it was on July 29th, 1940. And they met her in a cat Oxford in 1944. They quite often sometimes met prejudice. She landed once with 3 girls. They called it a gaggle. They landed in formation and landed, and one of the girls' flaps didn't work. It wasn't my mother's, and the CO came across and said, well, you know, which one of you silly girls forgot to use her flaps? And my mother looked at the other girl, and the other girl looked at my mother, and my mother said, flaps? What are those? And the girl said, oh, you know, Jackie, it's those funny little red lever on the left. And the chap with the CO said, I think they're joking with you, sir. So they tended to use a lot of humour if they did meet prejudice. And, you know, as I said, a lot of bad weather, they often gave people lifts. And one day my mother was giving a lift to some, some chap who needed to get from one airport to another. And it was awful weather, and it was clouds and rain, and it was bumpy, and she got him safely to his destination. And when they climbed out, the officer came over and said to the chap, oh, how was your flight? Terrible weather. And he went, yes. He said, not only did you send a schoolgirl to pick me up, he said, but she was reading a novel. And my mother said, oh, no, I wasn't reading a novel. I was reading my ATA notes. I've never flown this plane before. And I think he was really glad that it was landed before she told him that. So, yeah, how exactly did they manage to fly so many planes? There was 150 different types of plane. My mother had flown 82 of them. They had this little book, because a lot of the planes just had one cockpit. And they were given these ferry pilot's notes from the ATA. And of course, they were on a ring binder, so you could add more planes as the war went on. and take the old ones out that were decommissioned. And it was their Bible, because it gave them all the takeoff speeds, landing speeds, everything, the knobs, the whistles for each plane, one plane per page. And this is actually printed version, and it's fabulous reading. And you can buy these actually at the ATA Heritage Museum in Maidenhead. Go to their website. Not only are they selling lovely things like this, but they also have a Spitfire where you can sit in it and try it out. It's a simulator, a Spitfire simulator. So yeah, go on and have a look at the ATA website and them in Maidenhead. Of course, my mother's actual one, I've got her real one, and look at the difference. It is very much tattered, bit of old string, it's lost its metal scoop, and she's written on it her notes per page on each plane. They never went anywhere without it. It was tucked in their boots, and it was their life. It was how they managed to fly so many different planes. And of course, she was very short. She was only 5'2", and she couldn't reach the pedals for some of the planes. She had to take a big cushion. In fact, it was an old aircraft seat that she took with her, and so she could sit on it so that she was able to reach the joystick and the pedals at the same time. And some of the planes were really, really heavy and difficult to fly. In fact, when they started taking the women in the ATA, there was some very negative press from the editor of the Aeroplane magazine, who said, and this is C.G. Gray, I'm going to name and shame him, the trouble is that so many women are insisting on wanting to do jobs which they are quite incapable of doing. The menace is the woman who thinks she ought to be flying in a high-speed bomber when she really has not the intelligence to scrub the floor of a hospital properly, or who wants to nose around as an air raid warden and yet can't cook her husband's dinner. Well, Mr. C.J. Gray, I think that, you know, you were proved wrong. Lord Haw, broadcasting from Hamburg, said, "The rich men of Britain, who are being ruined by the war, have found a new way of getting their money back. They're putting their wives and daughters into the Air Transport Auxiliary at enormous salaries to fly vicious fighting aeroplanes, which these unnatural and decadent women will doubtlessly enjoy." Well, they certainly did. They certainly did enjoy it and risk their lives. The ATA men and women, you know, they were brave, and 10% of them as a whole died. And that was the same for the women and the men. There were 168 women, and 16 of them lost their lives in the ATA. So, as I said, when it was cloudy, they weren't allowed to fly. Now, Amy Johnson, she joined later on in the ATA, and she did the taxiing in her Anson to do the picking up when the girls had dropped or the men had dropped the planes off. And they were grounded from cloud, and Amy and my mother were both in Cardiff, grounded at the airport. And so my mother had 5 days with Amy, and of course my mother was like absolute heroine. Her heroine, you know, there was this older lady who'd done all that flying, and Amy had a soft spot for mummy and took her into Cardiff shopping, and told my mother, who never forgot this, that you must always have lace and silk underwear. And later on at Herne Bay, at the wonderful Amy Johnson Museum, and the opening of this beautiful statue at Herne Bay, they were talking about Amy and her love of silk underwear. And I thought, yeah, that's absolutely true. She told my mother they'd gone buying, and my mother always bought beautiful French silk underwear after that. There she is on the many different planes that they flew. And here she is with Hazel Rains. Looking very happy. She wasn't always on an engine. When they had days off, they were near the water, and they'd obviously gone out on a boat. So not only did she learn to fly, she learned to row. And this, she you know, livestock here. Her Spitfire, the grey Spitfire, which she renovated. And she said, oh my goodness, she said, this is the front, this is the actual dials of a Spitfire. She said, oh Candy, I've got to take a picture of this. She said, you've got to have a picture, I've got to see if it's right, if it's what I'm doing correctly. And so hence we have this little note of the Spitfire and what all the little buttons and knobs should be saying. Weren't allowed to ferry, except they weren't allowed to taxi the aeroplane on mud or
I think we might have lost her.
That's not your mum.
So they didn't want this to happen. So the ATA said, right, you've got to ask someone to take it to the runway for you. So my mother said, can you please take this plane to the runway? I'm not allowed to taxi, because the ATA just didn't want the insurance claim should this happen. And he said, yes, sure, love. He said, oh, here's the keys, follow me in the car. And she went, oh, you can fly all these bombers and you can't drive a car. It's saying it's unstable again, so I don't know what to do, Mark. So she was really happy.
We're still here, we can still hear you, keep going.
She was so happy because she said she's all this time she'd flown all these planes, but the one she really wanted to fly was a Spitfire. So her first Spit she had on her little chip that came in at the day with her different planes on it, maybe 4 or 5 different planes a day. She suddenly saw her Spit on the 13th of October 1941, and it was to take it from Crawley to Turnhill. She was so excited, and she said she sat in it nervously and the roar of the engine behind her, and when she got in the air she said it was a real lady's plane. It was like, you know, it was just made for her, and it was so sensitive to the touch. And in fact, you know, my sister and I used to spend mornings before school when my mother used to say, come on, let's pretend we're going to fly a Spitfire. Should the duvet can be the clouds, should you just hold on, it will don't even think about moving it, just think it, don't move it. And she said, you just think you want to go right and it will fly right. She said it's so gentle and sensitive when it's in the air, it's light as a feather. I sort of learned how to fly from the bed, never been in a plane at all, but this came in very handy later on, and I'll let you know about that later. She said it felt like the wings were your wings, and of course it had that wonderful throaty noise, if any of you have heard a Spitfire coming overhead. She later was to fly Spitfires to Burma. Her largest plane was a Viscount. But people are always fascinated by the Spitfires, so I counted them. And also, of course, another wonderful job in the war was actually making the Spitfires, the secret Spitfire engineers and the factory workers who were women who had to make Spitfires in secret. So I counted her number of Spitfires, and she had flown 396 just Spitfires in the ATA, and that doesn't count the Seafires, which are the naval version of Spitfires, which she also flew loads of. So 396 Spits in the war and 104 Spits after the war. And I'd said to my daughter, who was helping me count, add those two together, and it came exactly to that magical figure, 500. She flew 500 Spitfires in her lifetime, and one more when she was 74 years old, and I'll come to that in a bit. Her last bit, well, her first bit, as I said, was the 13th of the 10th, 41, and her last bit was the 18th of the 10th, 55, apart from the one when she was 74. So they were very special planes for her. But of course, there wasn't just Spitz, there was Wellington bombers, there was Hurricanes, Mustangs, you know, you name it, the little aircraft book says it all. Oh yeah, so then of course they'd done all this wonderful job and war was over. She'd met my father at this point. He was Captain Reg Moggridge, and he was it was at a party in his regiment, and they carried on correspondence all through the war. And she used to fly over his army barracks, and she used to write him a little note. And pilots actually were given an extra ration of chocolate during the war, because they were told if they had a headache or they weren't very well to take a pill. And they weren't allowed to take a pill, so they were to have a cup of coffee to the aircraft and say, if anyone picks this up, please keep the chocolate, but can you get the note, please, to Captain Moggridge, as he was at the time. And he always got the note. But he then was sent to India for 2 years, and they didn't see each other for 2 years. And he insisted that they got engaged before he went. And they used to write honestly to each other every day. And it's so incredible in the war, because as everybody kept in contact, the mail was amazing. And he would say in his diary, if I haven't heard from her, I haven't heard from Jackie today, I haven't heard from Jackie, if I don't hear tomorrow, I'm going to phone. And phoning from India was a big deal. So they did write to each other all the time. And when it came to the end of the war, my mother hadn't realised, and she'd taken off and the announcement hadn't been made. And she flew over Reg's barracks, and they said, oh, your wife's hit upside, beating up the air. And he said, I'm not going out, I'm not going out. She's heard it's the end of the war. If she sees me, she'll do something silly and she'll kill herself. And of course, it wasn't until she landed where she was going, she got out, she couldn't understand it. They all came and hugged her and whirled around and said, the war's over. But of course, she said she always felt that was with a little bit of sadness, because she knew that when the war was over, the ATA was going to end. And in fact, in her book, she writes before the next chapter a little ditty that says it all, really. It says, she said, I'll just find it for you here. You're out, they say, when war is won. We know of all the work you've done, but men must work and women weep. And women say yes, like a lot of sheep. So she did. So sadly, they kicked them all out, said thank you very much, goodbye. But she thought, well, no, I want to be a pilot. I trained to be a pilot. So she went back to Aeronautical College to finish her commercial pilot's license. And then she thought, well, I need a job. So war was over, and one good thing was that they could get married. So Reg and Jackie got married, and here we have a nice telegram from Faith Bennett, one of the other lovely ladies of the ATA, wishing them well. And of course, she didn't have, you know, they didn't have, material was still rationed. So of course the wedding dress was having to be made from the silk of a parachute, as many of the women did in those days, if you were lucky enough to have a parachute. And she was also lucky enough to be awarded the King's Commendation for valuable services in the air. Now, I only recently found the actual badge that she was given, which is this one, because it had said, I found the letter that said you must wear it on your breast pocket under your medals, and there it was on her uniform, still on the breast pocket. So she was very, very pleased with that. Of course, just a little sad that it was actually signed by Attlee and not by Churchill himself. So she joined the WRAF VR, which is the RAF reserves, and she found she could still fly at weekends for the next 5 years, and only a few of them from the ATA joined, so women that was, and with all their experience, of course, they were very valuable. And she found out while she was there, she could follow in Jean Lennox Bird's trophies, Jean Lennox Bird's follow in her wake, because Jean had applied for her RAF wings. Now, the women in the ATA didn't get RAF wings, and in fact, the men in the RAF didn't even realise that the women got them. And for a brief period, a few of them applied and did the wings course. Now, Jean Lennox was the very first to get it, and then we have Jean Lennox, and we have Benedetta Willis, we have Joan Hughes, Freydis Leaf, and of course my mother. Now, there she is getting her wings. I just love that picture because she's the only one in a skirt, and she was immensely proud of this. I'm wearing her wings today. Those are her like dress wings, and people didn't believe it. They didn't believe they'd got them. So in 1994, when the RAF now at last decided women were allowed to actually be on the wings course and get their wings, Benedetta had written to her newspaper and sent it to Mummy and said, "It's not true, is it? We got ours, the 5 of us got ours in 1950s. And this is Jean Lennox, who was the first woman to get them. And she had a lot of little mouth. She went and decided to apply to the RAF club because she had her wings, and she filled in the application form and omitted her gender. And of course, when she turned up, they said, "You can't come in, you're a woman." There's no women in the RAF club in those days. And so the paper, I found this newspaper cutting from the 1950s that Mummy had obviously cut out and thought, well, this is marvellous. And there she is, Jean Lennox, and it said, "Who is flying officer X?" And it tells the story of how she tried to get into the RAF club, who wouldn't, of course, have women at that time. And they said, "Oh, there's only 5 women who've got it." They listed them all. They said, "We've rung them, you know, Jackie Moggridge." And it says they've all denied it, apart from Jean's mother, who said, Jean says, "I'm not allowed to say anything." So what a wonderful woman. And she was a real trailblazer, and that my mother and the other 3 lovely women could follow. She, at this time also, my mother was given the Queen's Coronation Medal for her war effort, and that is there is the actual framed document. And then here, let's get it, there's the medal that I've got here, the Queen's Coronation Medal. So she was now flying at weekends for the WRAF, and very thrilled, but that lasted 5 years. And then, of course, they shut that down. They didn't need the volunteer reserves, and my mother needed a job. So she got a job for, she got a job having, you know, had lots of experience in the WRAF VR. She'd even had experience on jets, and of course the night flying she had to learn to get her wings, because the ATA, although they had loads more experience than the cadets there, they hadn't done night flying, because remember, they hadn't been able to use the radio or have any contact with the ground. So she was very experienced, but she couldn't get a job because she was a woman. But the only good thing was that the equal pay had finished now. She wasn't in the ATA, so she was cheaper. So people took her on, and I think that worked for her because she was cheaper and very experienced. So she got a job taking the Spitfires to Burma after the war. There were 4 of them, 3 men and herself. They did 6 journeys. And they went, as you can see here, this is the actual route they took all along here, and it was between Iran and Iraq, and they had to be careful not to go over Syria. It's because they were at war. So when they flew just over Iran, that was friendlier. They wasn't land in Iraq, it was desert. They took 9 stops all on the way. And of course, she being a woman, you didn't want to be landing in those countries. But you know, she took it, sense of adventure, and they were on the radio over Rangoon, and the flying leader, Leo Burnett, he said, he was talking on the radio, and they heard my mother talking, and the man said, "Oh, what you doing? Got a woman up there?" And he went, yes. And he said, "Oh, what's she doing? Sitting on your lap?" So of course, when they landed, Mummy was the 4th pilot of the 4th Spitfire, and they wouldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that a woman could have flown it. And they held them all up for about 4 hours while they looked for the 4th pilot, because they were very worried that he'd absconded, and they had to ring back to Cyprus to see that it really was my mother who'd flown the plane. As you can see here is Leo Gardner is there in the middle. My mother, they're wearing their white summer sort of uniform. There was a bit of fun. She was always a laugh, and it was very exciting. And she wasn't always flying an engine. She was sitting, here she is sitting on something without an engine. But Sharjah and Ladakh in India, and of course she did actually, they did have to force land in the desert. They weren't sure where they were. In fact, it was banned at Abbas, and they had to stay while they waited for a plane to be fixed. And I won't tell you what happened, because that's all exciting and it's in her book. So, Spitfire girl. So she thought, well, she got back from her lovely trips and thought, well, I think would be really great, you know, another sense of adventure. I'd like to be the first woman to go through the sound barrier. And she'd researched it. She'd had an experience on jets in the RAF, and she had to get a plane to do it. So she asked the Air Ministry, she asked private companies, she asked the Duke of Edinburgh to help her, and here you are trying. And he wrote back from Buckingham Palace saying, in your quest to fly a jet aircraft faster than sound, but your letter's been forwarded to the appropriate department of the Air Ministry, who may be able to advise you further, because he's unable, His Royal Highness is unable to assist you in your quest to fly a jet. I'm sure you will understand that it's probably difficult for the Royal Air Force to let you fly their aircraft at the expense of other training, i.e. the men. So no one would trust her with a jet. She did get to fly here, it says, where she's asking headquarters here, and they say she has permission to fly in a service aircraft, including jets, as a passenger. And she was fighting for this, I don't know, for 5 years. She was fighting for this because she knew that Jacqueline Cochrane of America was trying, and that Madame Oriol of France was trying. And she wrote to the papers and said, why should it be that other women, you know, the other countries, women are going to do this first? I'm doing this as a first for Britain. You know, as something, you know, we have a queen on the throne, and it's time for us to go ahead and get this. And no, the Air Ministry were just too slow, and Dodry and wouldn't see it. So here she is again, trying very hard. Our sound barrier girl, there she is in a Meteor jet. I've got that photograph, such a lovely photograph. And even when she got her next job, which was working for Channel Airways, and in this job, she became the first woman airline captain to fly passengers on scheduled flights. And she was very proud of this too, this and her RAF wings. And even then, you can see she's still, the headlines are saying, girl who wants to go bang. And even then, she couldn't do it. And of course, at the end of the day, Jacqueline Cochrane did it first, because they gave her a plane to do it in. Such a shame, when it could have been a first for Britain. So she was flying for Channel Airways. She got the job because she'd gone for the interview without putting her gender on the application, and she'd taken my sister and plonked her outside the door while she went in to have her interview. And she'd gone in dressed in a beautiful, you know, 50s dress, matching handbag and shoes, and sat there. And they were quite shocked to see that a woman had actually applied, because Jackie, of course, which she intended, she called herself Jackie, was a man's name. So she had, as I said, she was cheaper, and she had so much experience that they took her on. And she used to fly passengers to Jersey, Guernsey, Portsmouth. And when she was there in the Isle of Wight, she used to drop off and see her friend, Benedetta Willis, who was over there, and also Mary Ellis, who flew in the ATA with her. So, of course, Mummy actually taught Mary Ellis to fly, because Mary Ellis joined later than Mummy. And Mary Ellis was always so sweet about how what a nice teacher Mummy had been. But Mummy thought, right, now she used to fly in, and she wasn't allowed to speak on the intercom, because if she did, the passengers would be frightened. So the second officer would have to speak for her. And they also had a brilliant London black cab that she used to get out the plane, jump in the cab, chauffeur it to pick up the passengers, because in those days it was a full-on service, and then she'd come back out of the cab and then get in the cockpit. But those were the days. And also she decided she would write her book, and in 1957 she wrote Woman Pilot, which we have now had republished in 2014, republished as Spitfire Girl, but it's the same book, it's all her own words. And they've actually put it in a time capsule. The Imperial War Museum have put it in a time capsule and buried it, because they said for future generations they will never understand how hard it was for a woman to fly in those days, and all the things she had to deal with. And it was really, you know, she was ahead of her time. And I just think that's amazing that sometime in the future, my mother's book, and it will be the Woman Pilot version, will be in that thing. So she was, you know, had lots of press about it at that time. And the Woman Pilot was then made into a Pan edition. And then, as I say, that's the Spitfire Girl book, which is available now. She also got a job for Lek Refrigeration, where she was flying refrigerators back to South Africa, funny enough. And she was also worked for Meridian Air Maps, where she was looking, and was the first plane. She had the photographer with her. She was the first plane to spot Robin Knox Johnson when he completed his round the world trip. But she had some brief holidays in between, and there she is with my sister and her husband Reg, still in her uniform. And of course, my sister, being a very young girl, you know, at school, my mum went to pick her up from school one day, and she was flying home with her two air hostesses, and my sister was hanging out going, oh, there she is, she said to her friend. And her friend went, oh, as my mother waltzed up in her uniform. What is she then? Is she a bus conductor? And my sister was like, Mummy, never come to school again in your uniform. It's so embarrassing. It's just so embarrassing. You know what it's like. You can never please your children. Whatever you do, you're an embarrassment. So there she is, working for Channel Airways. And while she was there, she was awarded the Jean Lennox Bird Trophy for valuable services in the air. Oh no, sorry, wrong thing. The Jean Lennox Bird Trophy for furthering the cause of women in aviation, for becoming the first woman airline pilot. And here she is accepting the trophy. She was very proud of that, from the Women Pilots Association. And she said in her speech, she said, I long for a time when this wouldn't be a feature, that it would be commonplace for women to be airline captains. And I have to say, you know, even all these years later, 2020, we still have only 5% women airline pilots. And EasyJet are doing a marvellous job, because they are promoting women pilots, and they have 20% of their pilots as women now. So we're getting there slowly. And in fact, you know, when I was a little girl, you could always buy Barbie's air hostess uniform. Well, it took till 1992 for Barbie to get a captain's uniform. And when my mother saw this, she couldn't believe it, and she bought it straight away. And I thought, come on, Barbie. 30 years after my mother had achieved that, Barbie caught up. So she was back in the Havilland Rapide that we saw at the very beginning. There she is, flying it. There's the air hostesses that she trailed behind to give a lift to pick up my sister. And of course, even then, you'd think the women would be behind her. But, you know, would you object to a woman pilot? She wrote a poem to a magazine saying, "I'm always criticised, you know, for having a career. Yet if I stayed at home all day, the cost would be too dear. Our 10-year-old would have no clothes, nor I a thing to wear. My husband's smokes would have to go. It would make life hard to bear. Besides, we all would miss the fun discussing all we've seen and every little thing we've done and everywhere we've been. Please understand, you smug mammas who preach no jobs for wives. We work because it's the only way to brighten up our lives." And of course, the reply she got to this was, "Unless a woman is prepared to devote almost the whole of her time and energy to making of a home for at least 15 years, in my humble opinion, she should not marry at all." And so, you know, it was a struggle, but she persevered. And in fact, last year we found this comic, French comic, and I thought, oh, how lovely, it's all about a woman pilot. Well, it wasn't just about a woman pilot, it was about Jackie Moggridge. There she is, it's got my father in it saying that, she's saying to him, "Will you let me fly after we're married, dear?" It's got her joining the ATA, it's got her then becoming an airline captain, and a woman saying, "Oh, I'm a bit frightened, I don't want to fly with her." And it's got my sister in the corner doing her homework, plonked in the plane next to my mother while she carried on her career. So she also took our Father Lynch up from our local church. He'd never been in a plane before, and not content with everything she'd done so far, she also became a candidate for Halcombe Ward, a Conservative candidate in Taunton, but it was very much a Labour win, and always had been, but she did get a lot of votes, and there she is congratulating the winner. And I just wanted to mention that my father, who was the rock behind it all, he loved her dearly, she loved him dearly, and she deferred to him with everything. But he always said, people would say, "Well, how could you let your wife do all this and, you know, not be at home, cook your dinner every night?" And he said, "You know, if I could fly planes like that and do what she does," he said, "I would love it." He said, "How can I possibly stop her doing this?" And I found a little picture of her in his wallet when he died. He'd held that picture of her all his life. She loved to dance, she loved to sing, she loved to act. She'd been a professional pantomimes. And in fact, you know, one of the critiques said she handled her part as expertly as she handles a plane, in one of the write-ups. And she was on many TV programmes. So she's with Richard Dimbleby here on his show. She was on What's My Line? And she was in a beautiful French magazine, L'Illustré, in a big article. And there she is with my sister, who used to get plonked at aerodromes and with the air hostesses and wait for my mother to come back. And they did this whole article on her. And then later, well, when she was 74, she had a knock on the door, and Carolyn Grace is there, and she said, "You're the first person who's ever flown my Spitfire." And she said, "It's in the logbook." And she said, "I'm so thrilled that a woman was the first person to fly my Spitfire ML407. And she said, let's repeat the flight of that Spitfire that you flew to Johnny Holton, who was the same age as my mother. He was a New Zealand fighter pilot, and she flew it to him for D-Day, and that plane, he shot the first plane down on D-Day. And so 50 years to the day that my mother had flown that plane, they reenacted it. This is her logbook, and you can see there it is, Spitfire ML407, second one up. And she flew it again 50 years to that date. They set up the ATA chit just as it would have been there, and reenacted it. And it was from Duxford to Lynham, and she flew it well, she went up with Carolyn, who'd now converted it to 2 cockpits. And there she is in the cockpit. And Carolyn said, oh, she said, does it seem familiar? And my mother said, oh, well, no, I don't. She said, oh, no. She said, it was a long time ago. But Carolyn thought, right, and she was in the air. She thought, I know she's too nervous to fly it. So she said, I've dropped my map. Jackie, have you got control? And my mother, age 74, went, yes, I have control, instantly. And Carolyn said then she was flying it, and she said, you know, she flew it lower and faster than she said I would ever dare. She said, my God, did she know that plane? It must be like riding a bicycle. You never forget. And she, even there, she is even in fitting in her uniform, age 74, with Johnny Hulton, who was still alive there, and she's with Diana Bonato there from the ATA. They did a Telegraph did a Spitfire Heroes competition, and everyone wrote in, and this is in Hendon Museum, and she came second in the Spitfire Heroes, which is fabulous. And apparently it's gone on tour now around the different museums, and you can actually sit in the Spitfire. I would hope you're flying it. My daughter and I were lucky enough to be invited to the RAF 100 celebrations in Horse Guards Parade, and I actually saw the plane that is in her book, the picture in her book. The book's got pictures in it, and this is the plane that she flew in, and she's in the cockpit of in the book. And it was great to be able to look around it and stand next to it. And of course, what's really good about this celebration is that the RAF have now come full circle and are honouring women in the RAF. And they've set up a window in the RAF club, and this is it, in celebration of women in the RAF. And of course, they've gone one more and got the highest ranking officer in the whole of the armed forces in Air Marshal Sue Gray. So I'm here in front of the window, having been to the celebration of women dinner, and you can see here it's got WAF, ATA and WRAF there up on the typewriter keys and the stained glass. And my mother was in all 3 of those. And of course, I'm wearing her RAF wings. And even Strictly Come Dancing on Armistice Day did a wonderful opening of Jean Lennox-Bird getting her wings, and a whole dance for that, and the RAF women celebration of 100 years of the RAF. So, you know, what with, as I said here, the Spitfire women who made the planes in secret. The husbands didn't even know what they were doing, and there's a charity now for the secret Spitfires. We've got these stories told, and this is in Prague, in a art gallery. The whole corridor was lined with portraits, individual portraits of women in aviation, and my friend came across my mother there, and then the story of the ATA. So I wanted you to see her. This is her age 80, on her 80th birthday, with her grandchildren, Ashley and Lara, who she absolutely adored, and who obviously adored her. And now her grandchild Lara is drawing the pictures, and I've done the words for the children books, Up, Up and Away. And here it was the one where it says Jackie gets RAF wings today. And I think my mother would be so thrilled. She died in 2004, and I think my sister and I only realised that she was famous when we saw this in the Times, because we didn't give this to them. They had it ready, and it's all her life history there ready. And we thought, gosh, you know, she's done a lot. And the ATA now have plaques going up in the different aerodromes that they landed in. And here's one here. And it says the ATA flew over 150 types in wartime skies, moving at 309,011 machines throughout the UK and Europe, with no navigational aids other than a map and a compass. An extraordinary feat, never to be repeated, which deserves to have its place in history. And there they are, the women and men of the ATA at a reunion, just before they've nearly all died now, but this is one of the more recent ones, with myself and my sister and my daughter, Lara. Mummy was always an inspiration for women. She was so excited here with the Vicar of Dibley being a vicar when women could become vicars. And the day that her book came out, Spitfire Girl, reprinted, was the day also on the paper that the first, what comes after a vicar? The first bishop, women bishop, was allowed to be there. She would have forwarded that. She would have been so thrilled. So Gran would have been proud. Lara was the cadet, and she got the commendation for the year for being an outstanding cadet. Only one girl got it, and she was it. Wouldn't Granny have been proud? And Carolyn took my mother's ashes and she spread them over Dunkeswell Aerodrome, which was so kind. From her Spitfire, they can see the picture here, from her Spitfire, the Grace, and she took me up in it and she let me have a go. And now I just say to everyone that the only plane I've ever flown is a Spitfire, because she let me have a go when we were up there. And I don't think I've never flown a plane, but she said, come on, Candy, have a go. And she said, turn right. And I did exactly what my mother said. I just thought to turn right. And that plane went right, gently, carefully, slowly. And she went, oh my God, you're your mother's daughter. And I thought, no, it was those Spitfire lessons in the duvet. Yeah. So I just wanted to leave you with a word so you could see her. See if this will work.
It just looks like it's loading at the moment, so give it a second.
Yeah. It might not because we haven't got very good internet. So anyway, if it doesn't matter. Well, here we go.
It's all very well to have the mass production of aircraft in a war scenario, but you have to actually get those aircraft to the units that will need to use them. The operational squadrons don't have time to send pilots to factories to pick them up. So what you do is you create something like the Air Transport Auxiliary, mainly women pilots, many of whom had learned to fly in the 30s. But those who didn't were trained at Whitchurch. They flew many thousands of hours, not just Tiger Moth, but Fires, Blenheims, and even Lancaster bombers.
We would fly.
That's my mother.
We had a little notebook, about 4 by 6, and each page had an aircraft, be it a Royal Air Force fighter, a Royal Air Force bomber, a troop carrier, a naval aircraft of the Royal Navy. We flew just about, well, we flew everything. Anyway, I went to Wales to pick up this Albemarle, which I'd never seen before. And then a car came up with a squadron leader and his navigator, and he looked up and he said to the ADC cadet, where's the pilot? And I was only wearing a white shirt and trousers and sitting there, and he said, so the ADC cadet said, that's the pilot, sir. And he said, what do you mean that's the pilot? We're not only schoolgirls flying our aeroplanes now, are we?
Right. Oh, I hope you can hear me. But yeah, that's it really, folks.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. We've had some fabulous comments through, honestly, and Candy, we've got some really lovely ones. We had a comment from Peter who said he grew up in Hamble and he was aware of Satchel Lane. So that was lovely. Such a vibrant speaker, Candy. Thank you. Alison says, love the duvet story. She really enjoyed that one. Sheena says, fabulous story, fantastic example of stubbornness, which has led the way for many women. Thank you. And still the battle continues. Dave says, excellent talk. Thank you, Candice. Your mum was one of my heroes for many years. Sadly, I never met her. Thank you for this and all you've shown. Very inspiring.
Oh.
And then there is a comment here from Anne, entertaining as always, Candy. So lots of absolutely lovely comments there. So that's fabulous.
Thank you. Oh, it's been nice to be able to tell a story and hopefully inspire people to take to the air.
You've done it wonderfully. Thank you so much, Candy. Brilliant story, honestly.
And if they want to know more, obviously there is her book Spitfire Girl, My Life in the Sky, and I think Amazon are doing a deal anyway at the end of July and the beginning of September. So yeah, there's pictures in it and it tells you a bit more, takes you more in depth.
Fabulous. And what we will also do is when we share this on our website, we'll make sure there's a link to that book as well. So if you wanted to know where you can find it, that's it.
No more. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you plan on joining us tomorrow, where we've got Chris Goss, who's one of our aviation historians. But for now, thank you, Candy. Thank you, Jess, for organising, and have a lovely day and see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.